Historians often characterize the transition between eras as a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of the old ways. For 3 centuries, Europe had basked in the warmth of a medieval climatic anomaly, experiencing unprecedented demographic growth, the expansion of trade, and the seemingly unshakable stability of the feudal contract. The knight was the master of the field, the church the master of the soul, and the peasant the engine of the earth. Yet, by the middle of the 14th century, this entire architectural framework of civilization would be brought to the brink of total collapse. It was an age defined not by progress, but by a relentless sequence of systemic shocks that spared no corner of the known world. From the icy rains that rotted the harvests of the Great Famine to the invisible horror of the Black Death, the foundations of the High Middle Ages were not merely tested, they were annihilated. Within decades, the demographic surplus of centuries vanished. The social hierarchy was upended by the desperate labor of the survivors. The perceived invincibility of the mounted nobility withered under the flight of arrows and the first thunder of gunpowder. In this crucible of plague, famine, and perpetual warfare, the medieval world died, and the precursors of the modern state were born from its ashes. Welcome to our video on the crisis of the 14th century, a century of systemic collapse that forged the foundations of the modern era. Surviving the transition of an entire civilization requires a level of long-term planning and resilience that resonates with our own mission to document the vast complexities of human history. To help us maintain this depth of research and production, we invite you to consider supporting our work through Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. Your contributions are the lifeblood of this channel, allowing our team of researchers and animators to dedicate the thousands of hours necessary to map out these global shifts. By joining our community, you unlock access to an extensive archive of exclusive, long-form series that are not available elsewhere, including our multi-part deep dives into the Pacific War, the Punic Wars, the Reconquista, the Russian Civil War, the War of the Spanish Succession, and the North African Campaign. Beyond the content, our supporters receive direct perks such as entry into our private Discord community for debate and discussion, early access to our weekly releases, a preview of our internal production schedule, and the opportunity to cast your vote in polls that decide our future video subjects. These contributions ensure that we can remain independent and focused on delivering the objective, logistical history you expect. If you are interested in helping us grow, please check the link in the description below. We thank our patrons for their continued trust as we now turn our focus back to the shifting tides of the medieval world. To understand the collapse of the 14th century, we must first examine the fragile geopolitical landscape that preceded the arrival of the storm. At the dawn of the 14th century, Europe existed within a delicate equilibrium of expansion and agrarian stability that had defined the High Middle Ages. For 300 years, the continent had benefited from a warming climate that pushed the frontiers of cultivation into the northern reaches of Scandinavia and the mountain slopes of the Alps. This demographic explosion fueled the rise of massive Gothic cathedrals and the establishment of great universities, while the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa forged lucrative connections to the Silk Road. The Holy Roman Empire served as a sprawling heart for the Catholic world, comprising over 100 constituent duchies and bishoprics that looked to the emperor for a semblance of legal order. In the West, the Kingdom of France emerged as the preeminent cultural and military power of Christendom, its nobility embodying the pinnacle of chivalric warfare. England, though smaller in population, was a tightly organized and increasingly centralized state, having recently consolidated its grip on Wales and asserted a contentious overlordship over Scotland. However, this entire system was underpinned by a fatal vulnerability. The medieval economy was almost entirely dependent on a narrow range of grain yields, leaving no margin for error should the environment shift. The first cracks in this grand facade appeared not through the sword, but through the sky. In 1315, a series of unseasonably cold springs and relentless rainstorms signaled the end of the medieval warm period and the arrival of the Little Ice Age. Across northern Europe, crops rotted in the fields, and the salt industry collapsed, leading to the Great Famine. Within 2 years, hundreds of thousands perished as the social order frayed under the weight of mass starvation and reports of desperate cannibalism. This environmental catastrophe decimated the tax base of the great monarchies and left a scarred, malnourished population. It was into this atmosphere of economic exhaustion that a dynastic spark was thrown. In 1328, the death of King Charles IV of France, without a male heir, brought the direct Capetian line to an end. King Edward III of England, through his mother Isabella, held a direct claim to the French throne as the grandson of Philip IV, when the French nobility bypassed him in favor of Philip of Valois. Citing the Salic law to exclude female succession, the stage was set for a confrontation that would span generations. Edward was initially hesitant, but French interference in Scotland and the confiscation of the English-held Duchy of Gascony forced his hand. As the drumbeat of war intensified, the traditional boundaries of medieval diplomacy dissolved into a complex web of alliances. The conflict was never a simple bilateral struggle between two nations, but a systemic civil war within the higher echelons of the European aristocracy. The Plantagenet dynasty of England was itself French in origin, and its court remained a bastion of French language and culture. To counter the weight of the Valois monarchy, Edward III leveraged his immense wool wealth to buy the loyalty of the princes of the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Empire. Emperor Louis IV of Bavaria, embroiled in his own bitter disputes with the papacy, aligned himself with the English cause, providing a legal and military counterweight in the east. Conversely, France drew upon the old alliance with the Scots and the support of the blind King John of Bohemia, whose knights sought glory in the defense of the French crown. In the Mediterranean, the maritime powers of Genoa and Aragon navigated these shifts with an eye toward naval supremacy, while the great powers of the West prepared for a war of attrition. A much darker shadow was gathering in the distant east, far beyond the steppes. A tectonic shift in the Mongol heartlands had begun to displace trade and populations, carrying with it a silent, biological threat that remained as yet unseen by the kings of Europe. The final descent into total war was cemented in 1337, when Philip VI declared Gascony to be forfeit, and Edward III formally assumed the title of King of France. The era of feudal negotiation ended. The legal and economic commitments made by both sides made retreat impossible without total political ruin. This was no longer a dispute over land or vassalage, but a struggle for the very identity of the French crown. Armies were summoned, fleets were pressed into service, and the heavy tax burdens imposed on the peasantry sparked the first embers of social revolt. The mobilization of 1337 transformed the local tensions of the past decade into a permanent state of mobilization. The lines were drawn, the treasuries were emptied, and the armies of the two most powerful states in Christendom began their march toward an inevitable and bloody collision. Edward III's military machine represented a significant departure from the traditional feudal levy, relying instead on a sophisticated system of indentures that produced a semi-professional force of disciplined soldiers whose loyalty was tied to pay and shared experience rather than mere landed obligation. The core of this army was the Welsh and English longbowmen, a unit type capable of unleashing a staggering volume of fire, up to 10 arrows a minute, that could penetrate all but the finest plate armor at significant range. By the early 1340s, the English had refined a tactical doctrine that emphasized the defensive offensive, where dismounted knights and men-at-arms provided a stable anchor for the archers positioned on the flanks in a harrow-like formation. This structure was supported by a nascent logistical train, and the earliest recorded experiments with gunpowder ribauldequins, small multi-barreled cannons designed to disrupt the psychological and physical momentum of a cavalry charge. The English could rarely match their opponents in raw numbers, often fielding between 8,000 and 12,000 men on a major campaign, but they possessed a cohesive command structure and a tactical flexibility that prioritized survival and attrition over the grand gestures of individual glory. Opposing them was the most formidable heavy cavalry force in the Western world, a vast assembly of the French nobility, whose entire social identity and political power were centered on the shock of the mounted charge and the maintenance of a chivalric ideal that dominated European warfare for centuries. The French Valois monarchy could summon a massive host, often exceeding 20 or 30,000 combatants, comprising thousands of armored knights, their retainers, and large contingents of communal infantry, drafted from the burgeoning towns of the interior. Their primary missile support came from thousands of Genoese crossbowmen, elite mercenaries hired for their mechanical skill and the powerful kinetic punch of their windlass-drawn weapons. Although these professional units were often viewed with disdain by the aristocratic commanders who saw them as mere auxiliaries, the French doctrine remained firmly rooted in the supremacy of the charge, believing that no infantry line, no matter how disciplined, could withstand the weight and momentum of a concentrated assault by the flower of European chivalry. However, this reliance on the knight created a rigid tactical framework that struggled to adapt to broken ground or disciplined defensive positions, a systemic flaw that was exacerbated by the chaotic nature of feudal command, where individual counts and dukes often acted independently of the king's central authority. The theatre of operations in northern France was increasingly defined by the encroaching dampness of the Little Ice Age, turning the heavy clay soils of the Somme and Normandy into treacherous quagmires that favoured the defender. Strategic movement was dictated by the crossing points of major rivers, where ancient bridges and fortified towns served as the only reliable conduits for supply. A gentle ridge or a patch of wooded terrain could become a decisive tactical asset. Mud bogged down the heavy horse. The weather was a constant, unpredictable factor. Sudden thunderstorms often rendered crossbow strings useless. Visage was frequently obscured by mists. The ground dictated the pace of war. Psychology played a critical role in the decisions of the two monarchs. Edward III was a young and ambitious ruler, driven by the need to prove his legitimacy and maintain the morale of his heavily taxed subjects through spectacular victories. He was a meticulous planner. He favored caution. Philip VI faced a different pressure, leading a court that demanded aggressive action to repel the English invaders and maintain the prestige of the Valois house. He was forced to appease his powerful vassals. This led to a command style that was reactive and prone to reckless escalations. Confidence was high. Fear of disgrace was the primary motivator. The commanders prepared for a clash of systems. In the high summer of 1346, the brewing dynastic tensions of the previous decade finally coalesced into a campaign of movement that would redefine the European art of war. King Edward III landed at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue in Normandy with a force of 15,000 men, initiating a chevauchée, a systematic campaign of raiding and destruction designed to bankrupt the French treasury and provoke Philip VI into a decisive confrontation. For weeks, the English army burned its way across the French countryside, bypassing the heavily fortified cities to strike at the economic heart of the Valois monarchy. Philip, gathering a massive host of nearly 30,000 combatants at Saint-Denis, began a relentless pursuit, attempting to trap the smaller English force against the rising waters of the Somme River. By late August, the English were in a desperate position, their retreat toward Flanders blocked by a series of guarded bridges and deep tidal waters. It was only at the ford of Blanchetaque that Edward's vanguard forced a crossing, narrowly escaping the approaching French cavalry, as the tide rose to swallow the path behind them. Having secured a temporary reprieve, the English commander chose a defensive position on a gentle slope near the village of Crécy, realizing that his exhausted infantry could no longer outrun the French heavy horse. As the dawn of August 26 broke over the Picardy landscape, the English established a three-part defensive line, digging pits to trip advancing horses and positioning their longbowmen in a characteristic harrow formation on the flanks. The English waited. The morning passed in tense silence. By mid-afternoon, the vanguard of the French army appeared on the horizon, disordered and weary from a long march under a sweltering sun. Despite the advice of his more seasoned marshals to wait for the following morning, Philip VI yielded to the impetuous demands of his nobility, who feared the English might escape under the cover of darkness. At approximately 4 o'clock, a sudden and violent thunderstorm erupted, drenching the field and turning the slopes into a slippery mass of clay. The sun emerged shortly after, hanging low in the west and shining directly into the eyes of the advancing French. The Genoese crossbowmen, 6,000 strong, were ordered forward to soften the English line. They marched with heavy hearts. Their purvises were still in the baggage train. Their bowstrings were slack from the rain. They raised a great shout to intimidate the English, but the line on the ridge remained motionless. When the Genoese finally came within range, they unleashed their bolts, but the wet strings and the uphill trajectory sapped their lethality. The English response was a coordinated and devastating volley that many chroniclers likened to a fall of snow. The longbowmen, having kept their strings dry beneath their hoods, loosed a storm of arrows that tore through the unarmored Genoese ranks with terrifying efficiency. Within minutes, the mercenary line buckled and broke. Panic seized the Italian ranks. They turned to flee, seeing the retreat of his professional infantry. The Count of Alençon grew incensed at what he perceived as cowardice. He ordered the French heavy cavalry to advance immediately, riding directly over the retreating Genoese. The field became a scene of absolute carnage. French knights hammered into their own men. Horses tripped over the dying. The English archers did not cease their fire. They targeted the mounts. They found the gaps in the plate armor. The momentum of the most formidable cavalry in Europe was swallowed by a quagmire of its own making. The pivot of the engagement occurred as the first wave of French nobility reached the English men-at-arms, only to find a wall of steel and a continuing hail of shafts from the flanks. The English centre, led by the 16-year-old Prince of Wales, was briefly overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the French press. It was here that the tactical discipline of the English system faced its greatest test. As we saw in our coverage of the Battle of Bannockburn 3 decades earlier, a disciplined infantry formation could break the back of a cavalry charge if it held its ground. The English did not waver. Edward III, watching from a windmill on the heights, refused to send reinforcements, even as his son was beaten to his knees, famously declaring that the boy must be allowed to win his spurs. The French nobility, trapped by their own social code, continued to launch successive, uncoordinated charges into the narrow killing zone. 16 times the French reformed. 16 times they were repulsed. The ground became so thick with the bodies of horses and men that the later charges had to climb over mounds of their own dead just to reach the English line. The command structure of the Valois army vanished. The king's own brother fell, the blind King John of Bohemia, refusing to leave the field in disgrace, had his horses' reins tied to those of his knights, and rode into the darkness of the English line. He died there. The French aristocracy was being decapitated in a single afternoon. By nightfall, the physical and psychological collapse of the French army was total. Philip VI, wounded in the face by an arrow and having 2 horses killed under him, was finally persuaded by his retainers to abandon the field. The retreat was not an orderly withdrawal, but a frantic, scattered flight into the surrounding woods and villages. The English did not pursue, fearing a counterattack in the darkness, and remained in their ranks on the ridge. In a single day, the myth of the invincible French knight had been annihilated by a force of peasant archers and dismounted men at arms. The tally of the dead was staggering, with over 1,500 lords and knights and thousands of common soldiers lying in the Picardy mud, while English losses were numbered in the dozens. This victory allowed Edward III to march north and begin the year-long siege of Calais, securing a permanent English foothold on the continent that would last for 2 centuries. However, the victory at Crécy and the fall of Calais were soon overshadowed by a conflict of a different nature. In 1347, while the kings of Europe fought for territory, an invisible enemy arrived at the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Black Sea. During a Mongol siege of the city, the Golden Horde, suffering from a mysterious pestilence, reportedly catapulted the bodies of their dead over the walls, an early and crude instance of biological warfare. From Kaffa, the Black Death boarded the galleys of Italian merchants, following the trade routes back to Sicily and the ports of the Mediterranean. By the winter of 1348, the plague had reached the heart of Europe. The demographic collapse was unprecedented. In cities like Florence and Paris, half the population died within months. The machinery of war ground to a halt as the labor force vanished and the tax bases of the warring monarchies evaporated. The Great Famine of 1315 had weakened the population. The plague now shattered it. Fields went unplowed. The price of labor skyrocketed as the surviving peasantry realized their newfound leverage. This biological main conflict did more to undermine the feudal order than any English arrow, forcing a temporary truce in the 100 Years' War. As both England and France struggled to govern a graveyard, the systemic shock of the Black Death reached every level of society, from the papal palace in Avignon to the humblest hovel, and as the mid-century mark passed, the survivors looked upon a world that had been fundamentally and irreversibly transformed. The immediate cost of this tumultuous half-century was nothing less than a demographic and social cataclysm. The Black Death, having traversed the trade routes of the Mediterranean, eventually claimed the lives of between 1/3 and 1/2 of the European population, an estimated 25 to 50 million people in just 5 years. This loss was compounded by the devastation of the French ruling class at Crécy, where the death of over 1,500 lords and knights left the Valois administration paralyzed, and many of its provinces without traditional leadership. The sheer scale of the mortality meant that the agricultural engines of Europe ground to a halt. In the English countryside and the French heartlands, the land lay fallow, as there were simply not enough hands to harvest the grain. The economic shock was unprecedented, leading to a total collapse of the tax base that had funded the initial years of the 100 Years' War. In the short term, this vacuum of power and labor forced a fundamental shift in the political landscape. The surviving peasantry, realizing that their labor was now a rare and precious commodity, began to demand higher wages and the right to move freely between estates, effectively shattering the bonds of serfdom that had underpinned the feudal order for centuries. While monarchies attempted to freeze wages through decrees, like the English Statute of Labourers, the sheer pressure of economic reality made such laws unenforceable. In France, the captured territories and the ruinous cost of the war led to widespread civil unrest, culminating in the peasant uprisings of the Jacquerie. England, though victorious on the battlefield, found itself unable to consolidate its gains as the plague decimated its own recruitment pools and depleted its treasury. The grand strategic ambitions of the 1330s were replaced by a desperate struggle for internal stability, forcing a series of fragile truces that would last until the next generation of commanders took the field. The long-term strategic legacy of the 14th century was the slow, painful birth of the centralized modern state. The failure of the mounted knight at Crécy and the subsequent rise of professional infantry and gunpowder artillery signaled the end of the feudal military monopoly. Kings began to realize that their power rested not on the personal loyalty of a fractious nobility, but on the ability to tax a merchant class and maintain a standing professional army. The social hierarchy was permanently upended. The decline of the landed aristocracy and the rise of a more mobile, wage-earning workforce laid the groundwork for the early capitalist economies of the Renaissance. Culturally, the trauma of the plague and the failure of the Church to provide spiritual protection led to a new skepticism and a shift towards secular governance. The medieval world had been built on the idea of a fixed, divinely ordained order, but the survivors of the 14th century now lived in a world defined by volatility and the need for administrative efficiency. Finally, we must close the loop on the shadow that gathered in the East. The biological threat of the plague had indeed acted as a brutal corrective to the demographic pressures of the previous century. But while the Christian West was consumed by its own internal collapse, another power had been quietly consolidating. The Ottoman Beylik, once a minor frontier emirate, had utilized the chaos and depopulation of the Byzantine and Bulgarian lands to establish its first permanent foothold in Europe. The open loop of the 14th century, the question of who would inherit the ruins of the Roman East, was now moving toward a definitive answer. The systemic shocks that had weakened France and England had likewise left the Balkan states fragile and divided. As the century drew to a close, the focus of history shifted from the fields of Picardy to the mountain passes of the south, where a new empire was preparing to challenge the very heart of Christendom. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one. In our next episode, we will follow the rising crescent of the Ottoman Empire as it crosses the Hellespont to challenge the fractured kingdoms of the Balkans. We will examine the Battle of Kosovo and the ultimate fate of the medieval Bulgarian and Serbian states as they face a new, centralized power from the East. If you found this analysis of systemic collapse insightful, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our deep dives into military history and grand strategy. This content is only made possible by our dedicated patrons and YouTube members. You can support our independent research and unlock exclusive series by following the link in the description below. Your contributions allow us to continue producing these detailed historical narratives. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.